Yeah. So a couple people from nursing, from Rockford as well. Welcome to from public health.
Tina, we can barely hear you.
Okay, we are having trouble. We thought we had this solved just before. Is that better?
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. All right. Yeah, let me know if it's going in and out again. That's really strange. Okay. Okay. So good? Okay. All right. Welcome to
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to Considerations for Systematic Review Project Documentation. This is the third or fourth in our spring webinar series about different aspects of systematic reviews and what we need to do for them. My name is Tina Griffin. I am faculty with the University Library here, and I am based in Chicago as liaison to the Colleges of Pharmacy and the College of Medicine. And one of the things I actually really love to talk about is data management and data documentation and things like that. So that's what we're going to focus on today regarding, what does that entail when you're doing a systematic review specifically. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, okay, let me admit one more person and then we'll get started. Okay, so our agenda today is actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to start with a very, very overview of a systematic review, just to make sure that we're all on the same page for, what some of those steps are and where documentation might be needed. And I am also going to talk about software and what software will and won't do for this. And then I'm going to get into the weeds of what some documentation recommendations are. So pretty straightforward agenda for all of us for today. So let's start with our overview. So systematic reviews. And I should say that a lot of this documentation also does apply to other types of review projects. Not just systematic reviews, but we're doing this under the framework of a systematic review. And a systematic review is designed to identify, appraise, and synthesize all of the empirical evidence that meets a pre-specified eligibility criteria and answers a very specific research question. Typically, these are interventional questions if you're doing a classically defined systematic review. And they use explicit systematic methods that minimize bias and provide reliable findings and we use a reproducible, transparent methods to share those findings when we publish these systematic reviews. So that's the classic definition of a systematic review. What we find is that systematic review, when people say systematic reviews and how journals define systematic reviews, people are playing fast and loose with that definition. And that can be okay. What a lot of people refer to is people using systematic methods or systematizing various kinds of reviews. But doing a systematic review in and of itself is a very particular and rigorous process. And in order to do it well, there's a lot of work that has to happen in very specific stages and done in very specific ways. So some of the components of systematic reviews are things like you have to have a clear, predefined question when you start. Typically, because these are intervention-based questions, you can do a PICO-based question. But not always. You don't always have to have a PICO-based question. But most often they are PICO-based questions. From there, you have to do a systematic comprehensive search. In that process, there are explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria that you apply to the results of that search to determine what gets included and what you don't. Then you do a quality appraisal for those included studies. And only at that point can you actually look at what you've collected to synthesize and analyze what you have. And at all of those stages, it is transparent and it's replicable. So these are the very, very bare bones basic components of a systematic review. And the key is that it's transparent and replicable, which requires that we have a lot of documentation as we go. The process is fairly linear. You start with your question. And if you have been going through our series, we do actually have a number of different topics that cover aspects of this process. We've covered different types of reviews, not just systematic reviews in some of our early webinars. We have talked about what goes into a good protocol. So we have several searches coming after this webinar about how to construct literature searches and how to construct them and translate them to different databases and things like that. So I do encourage you to go back and look at some of the other webinars that we have in this series to get support and help on some other aspects of the systematic review process. But again, it is very linear in that you start with a question. From there, you can develop your protocol. And then you go into literature searching, you get your study selection, you do your appraisal, your data extraction and analysis, and then you can present your results. This typically is an 18-month process and takes a whole team of people. This is not a solo project. There are aspects of it that need blinding. There's aspects of it that need consensus among members. Again, to make sure that you're not introducing bias as a team. And then also, if applicable, it is not always applicable, but if the data lends itself to it and that you have study outcomes that are appropriate for it, you can perform a meta-analysis. Meta-analyses are only done within the context of a systematic review. They are never done outside of a systematic review. Now, that's not to say that you can't do other types of review and have quantifiable outputs, but those are not meta-analyses. So this is what this process looks like in a nutshell. It's long, it's extensive, and there's a lot of things that can happen over the course of like 18 to 24 months. 18 months is kind of average. A lot of times they go longer than this. A lot of times they can, very rarely are they shorter than this. So when you're doing documentation, a lot of people know that there's software out there. And the first thing that we get, especially as librarians, is, well, I'm just going to use software. It'll be great. And software will help you. Absolutely. We encourage the use of software at a lot of different points. But unfortunately, the software can only help you partially. So let's talk about that first. Some of the benefits. So benefits to software. Like I said, systematic reviews are done by teams. It is not possible to do a proper systematic review without multiple people in that you need them for screening, you need them for analysis, you need them for conflict resolution and developing consensus and things like that. So it is a highly collaborative process that needs blinding. And software helps you collaborate and organize. Those are the two biggest things that come up and the biggest benefits. The other thing with it is there is a typically with systematic reviews, because you are trying to gather all of the evidence, you are trying to get as much or as close to 100% of what is out there that could be out there about your topic. There is a volume issue with management. It is not unusual for systematic reviews to gather in, especially even with extremely seemingly narrow research questions, to pull in tens of thousands of articles, sometimes 20 or 30,000 articles. So it's important that you have something that can manage that volume. And that minimizes errors in a spectacular kind of way if you have software that can help you through that process. The other thing that software can do is critical parts of screening in particular need to happen blind. We want to be able to go through the screening process in such a way that we are not influencing each other's decisions as we're doing our assessments, as we are determining the data that's relative to our research questions, that we're determining whether or not a given article meets our inclusion-exclusion criteria and things like that. So as we're going through this, it helps us keep our work honest and blind to one another. I think we know the importance of blinding and things like randomized controlled trials, but we don't think of it as much in terms of things like systematic reviews. So that is a very big benefit to working with software, is that it can handle things like that, and it handles it actually very, very well and very easily. And software can also help us to extract the data. And extract is in quotes here because it doesn't do, I don't know of any data software that does the extraction for us. It's not going to go into the articles and find the data that's in there and insert it in your tables for you. But what it does do is it gives you a place, and when you set it up properly, it gives you a place to do your data entry. It will help you set up your forms and tables. And again, that minimizes error. So as you're doing your data extraction, as you're reading the articles, it allows you to do these things side by side. It allows you to do your things like risk of bias and your publication bias and all of the different elements as you're doing your critical appraisal. You can have that side by side, and you can have it as a form that you can just go entry by entry by entry. And you can highlight your documents in some cases, and you can put page numbers and notes and things like that. And all of that will be captured with the software and like linked in some cases to the documents that you're referencing. So it keeps it well connected. The context that you're doing your analysis in is kept intact, things like that. So all good things. I didn't specifically make a slide for this, but there are some drawbacks to this. One of which is that most software only covers these 3 stages. It will help you through the study selection part, the study appraisal, and the data extraction and analysis, which are the heavy lifting parts of these. But they can't always help you with the literature search. They can't always help you with the protocol. They may or may not be able to help you with results. Some software can. You're going to have to look at the software carefully to figure out what your needs are. You're going to have to look at your software and figure out, what your research question is. How many different outcomes you have? What type of outcomes do you have? Is that software going to work for what you're trying to accomplish? And in some cases, the type of extraction form or whether or not you can edit the extraction form that they give you may or may not work for the research question that you have. And sometimes the data extraction that they give you may not even work. And you end up taking it out and working in Excel sheets anyway. So there's still limitations for software. Software can still be expensive, and there's variability on how it handles. It's usually pretty good about groups, because again, it's designed to work collaboratively. But its features are something you have to look at very, very carefully. There are a lot of different software options because of that. We do have a research guide that gives a number of different options. These are only a few of them. There are more on our research guide. There's a link here at the bottom, and then Holly is also going to put it in the chat for us there so you can take a look at it. The university, through the Office of Research, provides Covidence, and this systematic review software is something that is managed by the university library. We do have a webinar later on in our series that specifically looks at Covidence software. If you do not want to wait for that series and you need to look at the software sooner than that, feel free to make an appointment with a librarian. We will be more than happy to take you through the software for Covidence, or if Covidence won't work for you, we don't offer specific support on other software, but we can help you determine whether or not maybe some of these other softwares might be workable for you and help you at least work through some of the questions of which one might be a good question. So feel free to make an appointment with us and we can help you navigate software. But again,
You're going out, you're losing volume.
Okay, we're doing that again. Is that better?
That's better.
That's better. Okay. Don't know what's happening in this. Okay. I'm gonna try to lean really close to the computer. Okay, so again, software, we are more than happy to make consultations about software selection, or if you're more interested in Covidence itself and its features and what it does, there is a webinar coming later on in the series. How software works generally. So like I said, most of them will work for that particular segment. And what you do is you would import the citations that you have from your searches into the citation or into your software of choice. And then as you're doing your screening of your titles and abstracts, the things that get approved would then move forward. You would upload your full text. Those would then get screened, and the ones that move forward then would get presented for data analysis and data extraction, and you would get presented with the tables that you've constructed for data entry. And what the software does is it keeps track of which literature is moving forward or not, and it uses that data to construct the Prisma diagram that you would be able to download. It keeps track of things like everyone's decision, so who's making which yes votes and no votes. It keeps track of any notes that go along with that. It keeps track of conflict resolutions as the articles are proceeding through all these decision points. Most of the software also calculates your inter-rater reliability, otherwise known as Cohen's kappa. And that is a statistic that they like to see to determine how well the team is, how consistently the team is in agreement as you proceed through your screening steps. It does go ahead and give you your data tables and forms that you set up. So it gives you that data entry piece. And then those data forms get exported out, usually in the form of like CSV tables, Excel sheets, things like that. And any of these things can be exported out for exclusion in your manuscripts. So this is the type of things that software is keeping track of. And like I said, it's usually doing it within those 3 steps. There are software that does more than those 3 steps. But you have to take a closer look to see whether or not that would be appropriate for what you can do. Now, I do also want to put a quick note and a caveat. With some of the software, they are starting to make some claims about AI, and that they have add-on AI tools for various kinds of evidence synthesis, including systematic reviews. I do want to point out these tools are very new, and these AI add-on tools have not been validated. AI tools themselves have known bias issues, and they have known transparency issues. So regarding systematic reviews rely on being transparent and rigorous and open. And because of the nature of the way systematic reviews are conducted, they are actively trying to expose publication and methodology bias. Again, AIs have different biases within them as well, but if you're using AI to assist in, say, screening and things like that, we need to be very, very careful about whether or not these are appropriate to use, because it does seem like there's a direct conflict specifically regarding transparency and replication. We cannot replicate the work that AI is doing. And for that reason alone, it is very difficult to say it's appropriate to use an AI tool for systematic reviews, because then the systematic review can't be replicated in and of itself. So any AI tool that is integrated into any SI software right now should be used with extreme caution, because that makes your systematic review not replicable. Everybody is jumping on this AI bandwagon, but I felt like it was important to bring that up because we certainly have not had a chance to look at all of the AI tools that are out there, and they're popping up faster than we can look at them, and they're getting integrated into all of these things. So be cautious as these things come out. I just wanted to let you know that before you run into a reviewer who has things to say. Okay. So that's what the software can do, and that's what the software can't do. But as it turns out, there's a lot outside of that software and outside of that documentation that's just within those 3 steps that we should be considering in the systematic review process. So what else should we be keeping track of at some of these steps? And I'm going to start kind of from the beginning, and I'm actually going to start with a few things that are actually outside of these steps entirely that we should be thinking about in terms of documentation for a systematic review project. So let's start with project administration. Project administration as a whole. Again, these are really, really long projects, 18 to 24 months. So we should have these basic project information somewhere. Project information, like what is the outline and the goals of the project? Who is involved? What are their titles? What are their roles? What's their affiliation? And what are their conflicts of interest? What are the expectations of the members who are on the project? Do we have any timelines, milestones that we already have an idea for? This could be things like, oh, we would like to get a certain amount of this project done so that we can submit an abstract for this particular conference, for example. Or we have a timeline because I would like to submit and get some grant funding for this, right? You should have an idea also of authorship and authors, who is going to have what level of authorship for what kind of work. Your authorship and who is involved and expectation of members are all tied together. And this should be known to everyone from the beginning. And this should be written down. This should never be a gentleman's agreement. This should be transparent to all members, and it should be documented. There is the credit that seems to be the standard documentation form that most journals are using for publications. So you can look that up as a starting guideline for authorship if you are looking for something to determine who should be authors and not. Also, funding sources. So whether or not this project is funded, systematic reviews sometimes are. Who are your funding, so you can actually properly disclose that. And also just keeping track of funding and spending in general of like, what did we spend the money on and how much, fringe did we have to pay out to the university and things like that. So all of that documentation should go in there as well. Documentation like this can go into just a single basic project administration type document, or you can break it out into several different things. It's not really that important as long as it's in a document that everyone can access and everyone can see. This is also a really great onboarding so that when people come on and off projects, because they do, again, this takes a long time, and it's a good way for people to find out how the project is going, how to get oriented to the project as they come on board. A little bit more about a couple of these things. Questions that you might want to document within this that go a little bit deeper. So things like what level of collaboration and what level of authorship. There are specific questions that you could document within this, which is, what are the expected contributions of each participant? What is the specific work that they are coming on board to do? Who's going to be writing things like progress reports? Who's going to be doing what type of work? Also things like personnel decisions, right? Are we going to be bringing students onto this project? What type of work are they going to be doing? Are they going to be getting stipends paid? Are they going to get paid? How are they going to be supervised? And who's going to be doing that supervision? Who's going to be doing any discipline or remediation if they're not keeping up with their work? Things like that. Similarly with authorship, criteria and processes for assigning authorship. What happens when, an author is not meeting their expectations for authorship? At what point does the group or the PI or somebody get to determine if someone no longer meets authorship requirements? And they only get an acknowledgement. I have been on teams where this has happened. And if this is written ahead of time and it's clear and transparent, you can avoid some very, very ugly conflicts by having this out there ahead of time so that people understand, no, this is what we agreed to. And, we have a deadline and this work needs to be done. And if you still want to do this work, this is great. How can we help you and support you get on track? But if you cannot be on track, then, we're going to have something that can actually get this done. We're going to have somebody who can get the work done. Authorship can also be the kind of thing where it's like, well, authorship can be the written manuscript, but does that mean that the authorship is different and the authorship line is different for things like presentations or conference papers or posters and things like that? So how is that going to be different? It could very well be different for other types of publications. So having that all written down and having that all documented for a large scale process like this is really, really important. A couple of other things. Data handling. For systematic reviews, you're typically doing a very large amount of data handling. Granted, it's in the form of literature, but that's still a lot to manage. And, do we agree on what software to use? And are we going to pay for a software or use the software or adapt a software that is available to us? And the software only handles up to a certain point of things. So how are we going to handle storage and access outside of that? If it is something that has to be paid for, who's going to pay for it? How are we going to handle data storage and access after the project is over? Who's going to be storing all of that afterwards? And maybe it's not that big of a deal when it's done, but maybe it is. So who's going to archive this? Maybe this project gets revisited in 5 years, right? Updates to systematic reviews do happen, and they're very valuable. So it's not unheard of for a systematic review project to get revived. And archiving is an important point for keeping all of this stuff well documented, well written out, and data handling in particular is something that is frequently not paid attention to. If you expect that this might be a topic that is going to come back again, I would strongly encourage you to make an appointment with me or Abigail Gobin, who is our data policy advisor, and we specialize in data management for projects and archiving and things like that. We're more than happy to talk to you about how to archive your project for later on. And another thing that's worth documenting is things like contingencies. What can you think of that might come up? Like, what happens if someone leaves a project? What happens with authorship? What happens to the responsibilities that they were going to take care of? Things like that. How will you decide if the project decides to take a left turn? And this I do see all the time in both scoping reviews and systematic reviews. As people go through their search and they start working through their literature, they see things that they're like, oh, this was a really interesting point. We're starting to see a lot of it. Let's pursue this outcome. But it wasn't explicitly stated in the outcomes they were originally looking for. And now the team has a choice because they're like, well, we didn't explicitly look for this. And it wasn't in our search criteria. So if we're really going to do this, we really should be backing up and redesigning our searches and maybe starting over a little bit to account for this. And half the team is like, yes, and the other half of the team is no. And you get this scope creep problem. And now we don't know where to go. And the team kind of comes to a halt. Or we have the opposite problem where they decide on the question and that all the literature comes in and the scope of the question was way too large. And they're like, we don't want to screen all this. And they're like, well, this is what it is. And they're like, and then they want to change it. And they want to revise and revise and revise and revise until they get down to a number that's manageable. And we're like, well, now you're not doing a systematic review because now you're just cherry picking what you want to do. That's not a systematic review anymore. So how do you handle when the research kind of goes off the rails? And you either discover something new or it's not what you thought it was going to be and it's scaled wrong, things like that. So these are things that can be discussed ahead of time and should be. Maybe somebody's just like, nope, this is what I signed off for, and you let them off the project. That's fine. Or maybe the project really is too big for the number of people that you have on it. You need to regroup and rescale and start over. I have a group that just did that. And that's a fine answer too. But they did have to talk about it. And it was written down. No hard feelings. But it was part of their documentation. And it did help them work through a collaboration better because they had documentation to do it. Okay. So that was a lot on the administration side. There's a lot of administration type questions that just as you're getting started, just as these things are going through, where you're like, okay, we got everybody on board. So that's great. So the next question becomes, we've gotten all that hashed out. Now we can get started. So what are things can we do in our documentation for the project itself to make sure the project runs smoothly and that we don't get derailed and that our project is really the best systematic review project that we can? And a couple of things that I do recommend just on the research question and protocol end. Again, we do have a full webinar on the protocol, so I didn't go into the weeds of the protocol here. I would recommend that you go back and watch that webinar. But regarding the documentation portion of it, when you register your protocol or you go through a basic protocol that's going to be published, sometimes the protocols, they don't have to be exhaustive, right? They just have to kind of spell out what you're going to do, right? So you can put your stake in the ground, you have your inclusion-exclusion criteria, you have your purpose and rationale, you have your populations and everything, right? That's the document that's kind of out there, that's your guideline, and that also communicates to the rest of the community what you're going to do. But for research purposes, the protocol really can serve a lot more to guide your project, to prevent scope creep, to keep your project on track, and to be a living document as you go through those 24 months. So I do recommend expanded documents in particular for your protocol. This is a great living document that becomes the source of truth in all of your notes as you go through the systematic review. This just becomes a place where you put all of your decisions as you go through this. Now, with the background and rationale, there's going to be this in your protocol as well, but it can also go with your administration information. And this is kind of a little bit of the deep dive of why this is important, where this fits in the bigger picture of science communication. This helps to onboard other people, like I had mentioned before. And that is incredibly valuable to save time so that everybody knows why we're doing this and prevents arguments when we make that new discovery and want to kind of follow down that rabbit hole. We're like, no, we're going to stay on task. We could start up a new project if we want to pursue that. We can kind of park it, but let's stay on task. We know why we're here, and it's to solve this particular question. The other thing with an expanded protocol is that serves to give us a place to put all of our question answers and decisions. And it can all be in the same place. So you just expand on it as you go along. And that makes writing the manuscript later easier as well. It answering reviewer questions later easier as well. So the type of things, and this is just a sample of things that kind of come up at various points, either through the systematic review process or in the reviewers or things like that. But write out things like your abbreviations. Systematic reviews can be very interdisciplinary, making sure everybody's on the same page with things like what everything means. Any abbreviations, document what all of these definitions are. All of your outcome measures, not just the definition of what they are, but specifically how they are measured and what that metric means. Because that way, if you run into something that might be measured slightly differently or looked at in a slightly different way, you have a way of saying, okay, we're going to exclude it or not exclude it based on, right? You have a very clear defining line of what do we want, what do we not want. And this goes also for your inclusion and exclusion criteria. We do see this all the time, particularly with study types and publication types and population types. That's why I mentioned those two here. Because I see, oh, we're going to do a systematic review and we're going to include all study types and all publication types. I'm like, really? You're going to include editorials? Oh, well, maybe not editorials. Okay, so you're not going to include all publication types, right? Because they'll say that because we want to be inclusive and it's a systematic review. So we're going to include all the things. So they'll write that in their protocols. But then when it comes down to it, they're like, okay, you're not going to include news articles. You're not going to include these things. But you don't write it that way. So when they encounter them, they're going to say, oh, no, we're not going to include this. Okay, we're not going to include this. And why not? Write it in your expanded protocol. So you have it documented. No, we chose not to do this. And here's why. Populations are the same way. You would think these things are cut and dried, and sometimes they're really not. A favorite example I like to bring in is young adults. We'll see, oh, we're going to include a young adult population. Like, okay, how are you defining young adults? Different databases define young adult by different ages. Happens all the time. Okay, well, we're going to define it as 18 to 24. All right, you have an age group, 18 to 24. Great. What are you going to do? That's it. So you're judging it roughly by legal age. Yes, legal age, 18 to 24, young adult. Great. What are you going to do if you have an emancipated minor at 17 or 16? Are you going to include them? Huh. Right. So what does young adult actually mean? How important is it to have that legality? Because you might run into something or you're going to find a study. And this is what typically happens is as you're going through the results of the searches, you're going to find a study that you're going to want to include, or it's going to have this borderline where somebody says yes, somebody else says no. And then you have to go through that process of like, well, why are we going to include this? What's the rationale for include this? And it's going to force you to make a choice, but you have to have a rationale behind that choice. So you make that decision, but then you need to document that decision. The protocol is one of the places where you can put those decisions. And then you might have to backtrack through your screening process to make sure you did not miss anything else. But then you can make that thing. Okay, well, we go back, we document it. Now, you wouldn't do the documentation of the methods here necessarily. We'll talk about methods in a second. But you would go back and say, okay, yes, we're going to include all of these things. So you would have all of this kind of adaptations from published reviews, inclusion criteria, all of this very expanded, very detailed notes. The idea of which is you want to eliminate ambiguity in any of its forms for your team at all points. And the protocol is what drives the whole systematic review process, right? It's going to describe your analysis. It's going to describe your search strategy. It's going to describe all of these different settings, and it's going to document those things. So it's a natural place where when you come into these questions, and you will, you're going to come back and document these things here. So it's a great place to put all of these decision points that you have. I can't recommend expanding these documents enough. So that's a big point, is the documentation and the expanded protocol. The other point that you're going to have a lot of documentation in is in the literature search. Those are probably the two biggest points aside from your analysis. Those are probably the three biggest parts that you're going to have documentation for. If you're working with a librarian, the librarian will help you with your documentation. We do have 2 levels of support that we give for this. Tier 1 is just consultation. This is the advisory level service. We're not going to do documentation for you. But on Tier 2, it will be co-author, and that is negotiated between you and the librarian and our capacity at the point to be able to do that. I believe we just put the chat. Yep, we put the link back in there to the chat again for that service. But if you are not working with us, or you are not using at least tier 2 service, the minimum that you need to do is you need to document the sources that you're using for your literature search. And what this means is you need to be documenting the databases that you are searching and the platforms that you are searching on. Now, this is where tier 1 service comes in, particularly because we understand that you may not know the difference between the database and the platform. Like for example, we know that we have PsycInfo as a database. It is possible that you could be searching PsycInfo like we have it through the ProQuest platform. But you could be searching or not using us, our librarians, as the people who are partnering with on your search. You might be partnering with another colleague at another institution and their librarians are doing the search. And they might be using a different platform to search PsycInfo. For example, EBSCO or someone else, right? So they might be searching off a different platform. And when you do that, that search will actually be fundamentally different. Because the retrieval will be different, the type of results that you get will be different. So it's important to document both the database and the platform that you are searching. And in addition to that, you need to also document the keywords and the controlled vocabulary that are using. Now, the webinar that comes after this one is how to start doing a structured search, and they're using PubMed as an example. So what we mean by keywords is probably what most of you do, which is you go into PubMed and you're just using words out of your everyday vocabulary to just search PubMed. What we mean by controlled vocabulary is using things like MESH subject headings. If you're familiar with MESH, that is the medical subject headings. That is the vocabulary that PubMed uses to find its vocabulary. And it's kind of like an approved mashup of a dictionary and thesaurus. Databases, not all of them, many of them, especially the biomedical ones, have a controlled vocabulary. And those controlled vocabularies are different for different databases. So you do have to keep track of how you put those keywords together, how you put that controlled vocabulary together, what that exact search string was, things like that. It's very specific. It's a very highly technical thing. Now, in addition to the databases and the platform, you also have to keep track of things like your search engines that you search and your great literature sources that you search. So your search engines are things like Google Scholar. Google Scholar is not a database, it is a search engine. It gets searched by keywords only. There are also other things like gray literature sources. There are various other platforms that you can search. We do have a gray literature link on our systematic review page. These can be things like association websites or other things similar to databases that you also use keywords for. So you do want to keep track of how you're searching those and the exact search string that you use. And for any of these, you also want to keep track of the dates that you searched them and the date ranges. So did you search all dates, or did you search this, and when did you stop searching, right? Because your searches should be ongoing until you get to the data extraction point when you stop collecting data and you start doing analysis. So all the time that you're doing your screening process, you should have a trickle of data that's kind of coming in until you get to your extraction. So when did you stop collecting your data? Things like that. So your search documentation is all of those things. And those searches, in addition to just describing I searched in these databases, these full searches should be provided as appendices so that this search can be replicated by anybody else that is looking at your systematic review. Like again, this should be transparent and replicable. So they're usually provided as appendices. It's usually presented as line by line or full search strings. Again, a tier 1 consult will guide you on how to do this, but I have a couple of examples on the next slide. And a scope note can be included on why you made certain decisions that you did. So sometimes when you're searching, there's certain terminology that you may or may not want to use. Like, for example, as a pharmacy librarian, I rarely use the term medication safety. There's no mesh or controlled vocabulary for that. And it makes searches really messy and introduces a lot of noise. But there are terms like pharmacovigilance that can be used in certain circumstances. So I use, when I'm doing searches for people, I have to construct very specific search strings if they're looking for medication safety issues. And so I include a note about why I used certain terms and not others, or why certain terms are very specific and narrow, because certain terms don't apply or certain definitions aren't appropriate. So notes can be included in the appendix about why we chose certain vocabulary. An appendix example on the left is a line by line search. So you might have seen something like this before. This is just an example of, say, like different ways that people have searched. And this is not the full search. I just took the snapshot of the search where it looks like somebody was looking for something regarding the cornea and artificial intelligence or machine learning. And they were starting to put some of these search terms together. And they do it in a very systematic line by line manner, where lines 1 through 6 they were grouping together, and it looks like they were starting to put some artificial intelligence terms below that, starting with line number 8. And this is so that if somebody came along behind, I could take these terms and go to Medline, which is what they searched, using the Ovid platform, and I can replicate exactly what they're doing. By looking at, oh, they searched for this word as a text word and this one adjacent to that word as a text word. I can replicate this exactly, and I should get exactly the same results, which gives me the same source of literature that they had. So I have database, I have platform, I have exactly the same terminology, and I have the exact same construction because they're giving it to me line by line. On the right-hand side, I have something slightly different. This is a search string that I can copy and paste, but it is not through, it is through a platform, it's through the ProCite platform. But this is a registry search, so it doesn't look like, it's probably a database, but it doesn't look like it has like a controlled vocabulary or anything with it. So it looks like it's just a keyword search. So I should be able to just copy and paste. And it looks like they're searching for things like IVF and ovarian issues with, it looks like luteinizing hormone. Yeah, luteinizing hormone, things like that. And it looks like they put these two groups of terms together and they got 208 records. So I should be able to go to the ProCite platform and use these two groups of terms with and in between them. And if I copy and paste those two together, I should get 208 records. Now, and they give me the search date as well. It's searched December 12th, 2021. So there might be a few more than that because obviously this is 3 years later. So, but if I get reasonably close to that, then I would be satisfied that I've replicated that search as well. So this is kind of what we're talking about. Can we replicate it from what we're given? And this is the kind of documentation for your search string that you need to be doing if you're doing the search on your own, is keeping track of things like this, keeping track of your full search strategy. So that's your literature search documentation. Optional but helpful is when you're doing your search strategies, you should be saving your searches in your databases. And then when your saved searches are there, you download your citations and then put them in the software like we talked about earlier. And then those saved searches will run and then send you new citations if more come in. When you do that initial download, They usually give them to you in formats like RIS or NBIB, or sometimes in an EndNote library. I would keep those citation files also as well. It is optional. You can always go back and get them again, but I find it's useful to just get them once, keep them like you would keep your other data files so you don't have to get them again. But strictly speaking, you don't have to have them. But I always find it's useful rather than trying to go back and get them again. These are the files that you would need anyway to upload into software. So why do it more than once in case you have to do it again? Okay. So that's more of the literature search part and things like that. The next 2 or 3 slides are about study selection and data analysis and things like that. Oh, and within that, this is where the documentation really varies. And so I have some very general suggestions for this because the documentation is really going to depend on what your research questions are, what your methodologies are, what type of outcomes that you have, the type of things that you're measuring with your systematic review, and things like that. So your documentation really just needs to be appropriate to the question that you're asking. So I just have some broad overview suggestions. And again, your study selection and things like that are going to be best handled. Your study selection and your critical appraisal and your data extraction and things like that are going to be best handled by software. So I'm gonna state that outright for these next few slides. Oh, okay. Just checking the chat, I was seeing making sure I wasn't missing any questions. So when you start building your corpus of literature, you've saved your studies and you're starting to do your screening and things like that. So you've done all your searches and you've got these literature search results and you're about to screen. I cannot strongly recommend enough that you do software. If you're doing a very, very small research study and maybe you only have a couple of 100 articles that you're dealing with, maybe a couple thousand, you could do it by carefully managing cascading folders in a citation manager and by spreadsheets and things like that. But software, even then, software is still your best option. If you don't, you do have to document all of the things that software would ordinarily be doing for you. So these are the things that I was just talking about earlier in the slides. So I'm not going to go through it exhaustively again, but you are going to have to do things like which literature is moving forward and which is not, and all of those numbers. You're going to have to construct your own Prisma diagram. You're going to have to keep track of everyone's notes, decisions, conflict resolutions. You're going to have to keep everybody blinded. So that's going to mean multiple Excel sheets, copies going to different people, and keeping track of all of those things and who got what copy. So different Excel sheets and keeping that back. You're going to have to calculate your own inter-writer reliability, which is easy enough to do, but you're just going to have to do it. You're going to have to construct your own data tables and things like that. So all of that, it is totally possible to do it. People did it all the time before software was there. So, but it's a lot easier to do with software. Similarly with quality assessment. So this is your critical appraisal stage. So once you have it in there and you have determined which articles are going to be included and they've passed your full text screening, now you need to determine their validity, their reliability, their applicability. You need to do things like assess their risk of bias. Is there a practical or statistical significance to them? Are they useful? Things like that. You are going to have to figure out, and again, this goes back to a lot of different variables. So I can't really tell you what documentation that you need, because it depends. Are you doing quantitative versus qualitative here? Are you doing mixed methods? Are you doing a tool or checklist? Which version? Are you adapting a checklist? Things like that. Whatever decisions you make here, you do actually need to keep track of those, and keeping track of how you're adapting them. And it's going to be very similar for data extraction and analysis as well. In all of your data extraction, this is your basic methods documentation. Keeping track of your numerical synthesis methods and your non-numerical. This looks very similar to how you would do a methods for any other methods paper. So how did you determine your grouping and your criteria for analysis? Did you use any other software and versions for your analysis? Like, did you use SPSS, Stata, any qualitative data analysis for coding and things like that? How did you address missing data or selective reporting or inconsistencies? Document all of that. Heterogeneity, how did you determine that? All of those things need to be documented. So how you choose to do that really depends. And again, there are some checklists and tools out there for those. We can help you find some of those checklists and tools. There's some great books on systematic reviews that have those checklists in them. So again, go to that systematic review guide that lists those resources in them. But there's a lot of variability, and it really depends on your research question and your outcomes for your documentation in these stages. There's nothing, I can't just point you at like, just document this, because there's just lots of documentation of that. And so congratulations. If you've gotten this far, you are now at the point where you can write your systematic review. You've got all of the documentation that you would have to write your paper, and get that review out there. So at this point, all you need is to figure out, how do you preserve this project? How do you share your results? And so I really only have a couple of slides. One would be, if you manage your project in your backups, which is saving your important data sets in non-proprietary formats so that you can come back to them. Save them to Box or other managed solutions so that you can revisit this project. Do not leave it on a department server somewhere, unless that department server is managed and is active in some place that you can do that. And also, if you're not actively doing it, or you only did it in the beginning, make sure you do it at the end. Update your administrative and collaborative documentation at the end of the project, so that you close out that project with a lot of your updated information at the end of this project. And consider archiving and sharing that project through our institutional repository. We can create DOIs for those objects. We can link those objects to the preprint or the manuscript and the data sets. And it does comply with our open access mandates for publications as well. So, in summary, good documentation takes place at all stages and starts before the project begins. Documentation is meticulous and it can be time consuming, and software only takes the load off part of that. And good documentation keeps the project on track and can help mediate conflict as well. So thank you for your time today. And I'm sorry I went a couple minutes over. Our next is on basics of building a search. So that's the next part of like that search strategy format. If you'd like more information about that, you can go to our landing page to register for that. And if you have an extra minute, I will stay on for questions, but there is also an evaluation link for today. And with that, I am going to stop recording and also open us up for questions.